Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the global digital book launch of Tyler Shipley's new book, Canada in the World, Settler Capitalism and the Colonial Imagination, recently published by Fernwood Press. My name is Tanner Burlees, and I'm your host for tonight's event. I'd first like to acknowledge that even though we're meeting virtually, I'm here in Toronto, and the land upon which we've organized this meeting is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. I also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. The Socialist Project, the Centre for Social Justice, and the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute, three of the sponsors of tonight's book launch event, oppose the forces and relations that continue to undermine and erase Indigenous peoples. And these organizations regularly publish articles in solidarity with the historic, present, and future anti-colonial struggle by Indigenous peoples for self-determination here and everywhere. If you're interested in learning more about the sponsors of tonight's event or engaging with the work they've published, please check out their websites. It's really wonderful to see such an incredible turnout for tonight's event. There's so many people. I think over 150 have been zooming in right now and joining us from near and far to celebrate the launch of Tyler's excellent book. I first learned that Tyler was working on this book back in November of 2018 when I bumped into Tyler on a chilly Toronto evening at a Toronto-based demonstration against the alt-right media and Trump strategist, Steve Bannon. I remember Tyler telling me that he was really deep in the historical archive on this work, and I remember saying how excited I was to read the published work. Well, I certainly wasn't disappointed. I'm happy to say that Canada in the World is now out, and I've got my copy, and you see it's quite dog-eared already. This is an exceptional book that offers an accessible and empirically rich introduction to Canada's colonial engagements in the world since Confederation. Indeed, Tyler argues that colonialism, the project to establish settler capitalism in North America, and the white racist assumption that Europeans were more advanced and thus deserved to conquer the Indigenous peoples here and elsewhere, lives at the very heart of Canada, as well as in Canada's role around the world, even today. Through a close examination of Canadian foreign policy, from crushing an Indigenous rebellion in El Salvador, peacekeeping missions in the Congo and Somalia, Cold War interventions in Vietnam and Indonesia, and participation in the global war on terror, Tyler highlights continuities across more than 150 years of history and probes the colonial imagination that has shaped Canada's actions around the globe. So it's great to see that Tyler's book has already received widespread acclaim by many prominent scholars and researchers. So Shireen H. Razak, Distinguished Professor at the Penny Cantor Endowed Chair in Women's Studies in the Department of Gender Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles, says that Shipley's meticulously traces the racial capitalist line that runs through Canadian history, insisting that we understand that Canada moves in the world as a state that is dedicated first and foremost to the interests of white capital. David P. Thomas, Associate Professor in the Department of Politics and International Relations at Mount Allison University, describes Tyler's book as fundamentally disruptive, to quote the notion that Canada is a benevolent, helpful, middle power, and sets the record straight on the colonial and imperial aspects of the Canadian state today, end quote. Ian Mackay, chair of the Wilson Institute for Canadian History at McMaster University, says that, quote, Canada in the world should be both rigorously studied and strenuously debated by all those who seek to understand the country's past, transform its present, and reimagine its future, end quote. And finally, Veldon Coburn, an assistant professor in the Institute of Indigenous Research and Studies at the University of Ottawa, who has kindly joined us for this evening's event, and welcome to Velden, says, quote, Shipley's outstanding scholarship is matched by the accessibility of his writing. This book will reach across audiences of all varieties, as it deserves. So congratulations, Tyler. That is a wonderful assessment and praise for the work. It's an excellent work that I've learned a tremendous amount from already, and it's definitely something that I'll return to in the years to come. All right, so moving forward, here's kind of how the night's going to go. Tyler's going to speak for about 15 to 20 minutes about the book's argument. And then after that, we have three respondents who we're really happy to have with us here this evening. And they're going to share their thoughts and their assessment of the book and the contribution that it makes. So after Tyler's chat, we're going to be hearing from Cassandra Kislenko, a queer autistic writer involved in tenant solidarity organizing in Toronto. We're also going to hear from Sara Jaffri, who is currently involved in building and supporting independent working class media and engaged in all kinds of labor and neighborhood tenant organization struggles in Toronto as well. And then we're going to hear from Veldon Coburn, who I introduced a few moments earlier. And then after that, we're going to have about 30 minutes or so for a question and answer period with the author. Over to you, Tyler. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Tanner. Thank you all. Thanks to everyone who's here. I want to thank the sponsors of the event, Canadian Foreign Policy Institute, the Socialist Project, Another Story Bookstore, Fernwood Publishing, of course, the Canada Files, kind of an unofficial sponsor of the event as well. All of you for being here, everyone who helped in putting this work together, which is a huge number of people in terms of both the research side and the publishing side, the editing. The original manuscript was, I won't say thousands of pages, but it was big, and it was quite a process to get it down even to the size that it is. I'm famously not necessarily an easy person to edit. So I want to thank everyone at Fernwood and everyone who was involved in that process. And I want to thank Tanner for putting this all together. I couldn't have done any of this. It's a miracle that I'm on the screen at all and that you can hear me. So all of this is possible because Tanner did this for me, for us. So I'm really, really grateful. Thank you so much, Tanner. This book is I think a culmination of work that I've been doing for more than a decade. Work that had little pieces here and there. My previous book was about Canada's role in supporting the overthrow of the government in Honduras in 2009, which is, one small piece of the story that I tell in this book. Fundamentally, what I sort of came to when I was doing this work was that every piece of contemporary Canadian foreign policy that I looked at had characteristics that reminded me of colonialism. And so what I did in the book was I started with what I argue is Canada's foundational foreign policy, and that is its colonial policy. So I argue that the French, the British settlers, and later Canada has its first experience in foreign policy in its relations with Indigenous nations, which, by the way, everyone agreed upon at the time. Settlers understood that they were engaged with foreign nations. Indigenous nations understood that they were engaging with foreign nations. There was no question as to the fact that these were foreign nations interacting with one another. And I emphasize this only because part of the project of colonialism over the past 150 years has been to turn that experience into a domestic issue, to claim that Canada's relations with Indigenous nations is a domestic problem, an internal affair, which I think speaks precisely to the colonial project itself, insofar as it took foreign nations and claimed them to be part of Canada. So I go back to that initial relationship that Canada forms with Indigenous nations, and I argue that that is a foundational piece of foreign policy. In that foreign policy, I identify two dynamics that I think are central. And obviously there's more. There's a million other things that I could have brought in, but there were two things that I sort of distilled at the center of this. The first is a material economic compulsion to steal this land and transform it into capitalist property. and to establish capitalist property relations and the conditions on this land for capital accumulation for the rich. Everything that Canada does, everything that the British settlers and later Canada does, is geared towards this material goal: get the land converted into capitalist property. And I see this. We see this in later events in Canadian history, as I'll speak about in a moment. So that's one piece. That's the settler capitalism piece. The other half is, of course, this colonial imagination, and this is the sort of ideological belief that Europeans are providentially destined to rule the world because, according to this sort of white supremacist idea, because Europeans are more advanced, more civilized, more modern, more rational, and therefore equipped and deserving to be at the top of a kind of racial hierarchy. These were ideas that were very explicit and explicitly articulated by the leaders, European ruling classes around the time Canada was formed. It's not so explicitly spoken today, usually, but I would argue, and I do argue in the book, that ideology remains central to Canada's relationships around the world. And obviously it's central to the dynamics within Canada as well. But specifically in this book, I talk about the way that white supremacy and the colonial imagination reappears throughout Canada's foreign relations. So these are the two dynamics that I identify. And again, obviously there is a lot more, but these are two pieces that I think are really foundational in Canada's foreign relations with Indigenous nations. And I do that at the start of the book. The rest of the book then is working its way through Canadian history and extending that analysis to see where it fits in Canada's other engagements in the world. And, I have to say that when I started working on this book, I obviously expected to find, I didn't, I knew what I was sort of embarked on. I was expecting to find that, yes, those two dynamics repeat themselves throughout Canada's relations abroad. I was surprised by how consistent it proved to be. I found myself, and part of the reason the book got so big was that where I expected to find particular cases, specific cases where it would be clear that there's a connection. I had done that work on Honduras. We could talk about El Salvador in the 1930s, the Congo in the 1960s. I expected to find case studies, of course, Afghanistan, more recently, Iraq. What surprised me was that everywhere I looked, in every case that I took up, I found those same dynamics. Support for the broader capitalist project and a deep-rooted belief in the concept of white supremacy, the ideology that Europeans know best, that Euro-Americans know best and deserve to be in charge. So the book kind of catalogs Canada's movement through the world in sort of replicating these dynamics. And I found so many case studies, and I've been sharing as sort of little mini vignettes. I've been sharing some of these through I set up a Twitter account, Facebook account for the book, and I've been sharing some of these stories. Some that I've already talked about. El Salvador in the 1930s. There is an indigenous uprising against the dictatorship of El Salvador, and one of the main concerns that people in El Salvador in the 1930s have is with a Canadian company, a Montreal-based company called International Power, that has a virtual monopoly on electricity provision in El Salvador, and is charging exorbitant rates that are extremely high, which it can do because there is no other provider, and it has a cozy relationship with the dictatorship in El Salvador. This popular uprising emerges. The Canadian company is one of the many things that people are upset about, and the dictatorship in El Salvador asks Canada for help. which Canada happily sends. 2 gunships, Canadian naval vessels, are sent to El Salvador. They dock on the coast. The commander of one of the ships gets off and meets with the dictatorship. And then the Canadian sailors and commander sort of wait in the harbor while the Salvadoran military commits a horrific massacre of this indigenous movement, people who were certainly guerrilla fighters against the regime, but also just people who were indigenous and maybe supported or even didn't support the movement. It is remembered in El Salvador as La Matanza, the massacre. This is, still considered one of the most horrific events in modern Salvadoran history. And it was Canadian ships that were docked in the harbor and which arguably empowered the dictatorship to carry out this attack. I mean, this is according to them. This is according to the dictatorship itself. The general of the Salvadoran armed forces said that the arrival of the Canadians provided a huge morale boost. His soldiers at that point believed that they would in fact be able to carry out this attack, and they did. And then the Canadian commander had golf or had lunch and played golf with the Salvadoran general. This is just one of so many case studies that I pulled together for the book to illustrate the kind of continuity between Canada's colonial policies and its broader, I would argue, imperialist foreign policies. You see in the story in El Salvador, certainly the white supremacy, it's very clear. In fact, Canadian Prime Minister, it was Prime Minister Bennett, was perfectly happy to assist the general in committing this massacre against what he called, quote, communist Indians. So there was no question about who the victims were going to be, and no question that the Canadian government supported this attack. You see that throughout Canadian history. And so the book kind of pulls together these case studies, and there are so many. I mean, I can't possibly touch upon all of them today. When India gains its independence, Canadian magazines say, India is not a nation. India cannot be a nation. It can never be a nation. Canada is staunchly opposed to independence for India, Pakistan. In fact, Canada is consistently opposed to decolonization around the world, repeatedly lectures the colonized people of the world that they need a longer period of tutelage under European supervision. And Canada often criticizes European powers for relinquishing control too soon. In Vietnam, when Vietnamese forces defeat the French at Dien Bien Phu and declare an independent Vietnam, the Canadian Prime Minister, Louis Saint Laurent, gets up in Parliament and laments the tragic end of the conflict at Dien Bien Phu and salutes the heroes of that tragic conflict. And by the heroes, he means the French colonial soldiers. So here again, you see Canada siding with the forces of white supremacy. You see that again and again and again. This coincides with Canada's support for maintaining a capitalist world throughout this period. Canada is very active in the Korean War, which is explicitly about making sure that Korea not join the socialist or communist bloc. Korean War is a very misunderstood piece of history, but certainly, for our purposes here, I can say that there was a indigenous Korean movement that had fought against Japanese imperialism, had fought against fascism, and was trying to build what they had called a People's Republic, the Korean People's Republic. The Korean War was about interfering with that, making sure that wouldn't be possible. The United States propped up a dictatorship in the South under Syngman Rhee, and Canada played a central role, a very, very important role in helping to prosecute that war, a horrific war. Vietnam, Indonesia, the Congo in the 1960s, Chile in the 1970s, the overthrow of Salvador Allende. You get case after case after case where Canada explicitly and materially supports the forces of capitalism and colonialism and white supremacy consistently. Another piece in the book that some people might be surprised by, to a certain extent, maybe even I was as I was working through it, was the way in which some of the cases that are usually thought of as good examples of the moments where Canada did something good. I work really hard to demystify those, not because I desperately want to just criticize for the sake of criticizing, but because it's confusing. It's confusing to me. If Canada is founded on principles of white supremacy and capitalism and colonialism, why would it suddenly in 1939 become Antifa and fight against Nazi Germany? In a sense, this is a surprise. It probably wouldn't be to a mainstream Canadian audience that thinks that Canada had always opposed fascism, but that audience will be surprised to know perhaps that Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King met with Hitler and was dazzled by him in 1937. And as late as 1938, the Prime Minister was desperately trying to find peace with Hitler. They agreed on many points, and I detail this from his diaries in the book. But why does Canada suddenly change its mind then? Does the Canadian ruling class suddenly become, have a moral crisis and decide that fascism is actually bad after all those years of supporting it? Well, no, of course not. So what I do in the book is I assess some of those moments: the World Wars, the Suez Crisis, Vietnam, apartheid in South Africa, moments when we've been taught that Canada was right and did the right thing, and in some ways did. I mean, let me be clear. It's obviously good that Canada fought against Nazi Germany in the Second World War. I don't want to be misunderstood here. Canada ends up on the right side of history, briefly, but it is brief. And there are a specific set of circumstances, particularly the threat that Nazi Germany posed to the supremacy of the British and American empires in capitalism. That is what really shakes up the Canadian ruling class and has them line up behind the Allies and join the war effort. If it was simply abhorrence to fascism, you would have to ask, why was Canada so permissive of the rise of fascism for nearly 20 years, supported the rise of Mussolini, supported the rise of Franco in Spain? Even when individual Canadians had gone to Spain to fight against fascism, the Canadian government opposed those individuals, enforced a strict policy of neutrality, in part because Hitler had asked William Lyon Mackenzie King to do that. So a piece of the book that may surprise people is these cases that are supposedly the good moments, the moments when Canada stepped up and did something right. And I really work to demystify those and to make sense of why. If Canada does land on the right side of history in some cases, as it briefly did at times during the Civil War in Central America in the 1980s, as it briefly did with respect to apartheid in South Africa, why does it end up on the right side of history in those moments and yet not in others? I mean, why oppose apartheid briefly in South Africa, but not oppose the same policies, the same principles in Israel? So I kind of try to work through a lot of that history. And in every case, every single case that I look at in the book, it becomes very clear that those foundational aspects of Canadian foreign policy, the protection of the creation and protection of a capitalist economy and the conditions for capitalist profit, and an ideological commitment, an ideological certainty that Europeans, Euro-Americans, white people are providentially destined to rule the world. Which I know when I say it that way sounds a little extreme, but I often pull direct quotes. I usually prefer to let individual Canadians, sort of articulate these things themselves, and they do. In reading the book, you will see what Canadians said. You'll see what Canadians said about people in Papua New Guinea. Canadian officials, making claims that they were barely out of the trees. That's a direct quote. You'll see the terms that Canadians used for people in the Congo when Canada was there on a peacekeeping mission. And of course, that peacekeeping mission ends with a Canadian peacekeeper helping to have the Prime Minister of the Congo, Patrice Lumumba, assassinated. So I think I'm probably pushing up against my time limit here. I guess a couple of last things I want to just say. I think this book can be a really useful reference. I hope that it can be a really useful reference for people on the Canadian left. You know, there are a lot of books in the last 10, 15 years that are starting to really unearth different pieces of the Canadian story that had usually been ignored, whether that's in, you know, on the colonial side with respect to Canada's relations and treatment of Indigenous nations, or more broadly on the foreign policy sort of side. And of course, that's been especially the case more recently because the war on terror really kind of started to expose Canada's aggressive posture in the world. So there has been a growing literature on all of this, and I don't claim that this book is treading a lot of new ground in terms of research. Almost everything in this book is based on secondary sources. I'm pulling together and weaving together a story from research that's been done by others. But I do think that there is a somewhat unique contribution here insofar as it's all together in one place. So, you know, if you're in an argument on Twitter, you know, and someone's insisting that Canada's always been good, look at how great Canada's always been to, you know, the people of Guatemala. Well, you know, check the index and you'll find the sections that deal with Canada's relations with Guatemala. You'll see the ways in which Canadian mining companies have exploited Guatemalans, both in the past and in the present. You'll find Canada's contribution to the overthrow of the Guatemalan government in 1954, support for the dictatorships in the 1980s, and so on. So I think the book can be a really useful reference in that sense. It can pull together a lot of things. I also think, and you know, I hope anyone who reads it will agree. I don't know, but as I was doing the work, what started out, what I expected to have as a kind of series of case studies, it ended up being more of a cohesive narrative of the 20th century, especially, because in order to explain how Canada had interacted or interfered in or participated in world affairs at various moments, I actually needed to explain the broader dynamics of those moments. You know, whether it's the First World War, you know, the rise of the left, the rise of fascism in the 1930s, the Cold War, the War on Terror, you know, any of these moments, I really actually had to explain a bit more about the history of these events in order to make sense of Canada's position. You know, to understand how Canada had supported a kind of colonial policy with respect to the creation of Israel. You really have to understand the anti-Semitism that is so active in the 1930s that leads to the rise of the Nazis. You have to understand Canada's relationship to that, Canada's relationship to Canada's anti-Semitic relationship to Jewish refugees who are trying to flee the Holocaust to come to Canada, and Canada says no. You have to understand what it is about the Zionist project to create Israel that appeals to Canada. And so in order to do this, and to make some real sense of Canada's choices, I had to explain those actual moments. I had to explain the broader dynamics of those historical periods and situations. So I think the book can sort of double as a kind of history of the world in the 20th and 21st century, albeit one that is very focused on Canada's role in all of that. But yeah, I mean, I do hope that it can sort of serve that purpose as well. Let me see. Is there anything else that I wanted to say? I mean, I think for the most part, I'm pretty happy to just you know, turn it over to the other speakers and take questions. Ultimately, this is a book that is grounded in a materialist understanding of history, which is to say that I understand history to be driven by the class forces at work in various moments in various societies. I understand the Canadian colonial project to be a consequence of the rise, a consequence and partially creator of the rise of capitalism, the transatlantic slave trade, the broader colonial project that begins in 1492, the conquest of all Indigenous land. Canada is created in that context. And I tried to write this book in a way that instead of focusing on history as being driven by the ideas of great thinkers, I understand history as being driven by the dynamic sort of interactions between various groups of people, classes of people, settlers versus Indigenous people, capitalists versus workers, and so on. And so, I try to kind of provide an overview of Canada's place in the world, which encompasses both its relations with Indigenous nations, its relationships with other countries, its class relationships inside Canada, immigration, the sort of racial hierarchies and dynamics and gendered hierarchies and dynamics that exist within Canada, and which Canada imposes on the rest of the world. I hope this is going to be a valuable contribution. We'll see what you all think, but that's I guess what I would have to say. And thank you all again for being at this event.
Thanks so much, Tyler. Absolutely. This is a terrific, comprehensive overview of Canada's colonial and now new imperial role in the world. And I think it really does work well as a myth-busting exercise at the same time. I think Tyler mentioned earlier, if you're getting to a Facebook argument or a Twitter argument about some facet or moment of Canadian foreign policy history, this is definitely the book to turn to. And it's tremendously accessible and well-written, as well as erudite and sophisticated. So definitely great work here. So we're going to get some more, I hope, laudatory, maybe reflexively critical at times, comments from our respondents who have joined us tonight. And so I would just like to welcome Cassandra Caslenko. Welcome, Cass.
It's a pleasure to be here. So I will admit I was pretty surprised when Tyler first asked me to speak at this event. Mostly because I didn't really know if I'd earned it. I'm not an academic. I'm not a huge organizer or anything. I'm a journalist, but I don't write on this stuff that extensively. I knew Tyler from 2017 when I started and immediately abandoned a podcast project very briefly. And that podcast was for Canada 150. And I forget exactly how I came onto it, but at some point I wanted to talk about Canada, and somebody from one of Tyler's classes said, hey, check out this prof. He talks about politics in Canada and history in a really cool way. And then I looked him up and I was like, oh shit, I know that guy from a band back in Winnipeg, way back in the day. And so when the conversations that I originally had with Dr. Shipley were really just me figuring out politics and asking him questions about, I think one was about North Korean propaganda, one was about Latin America, and eventually for Canada 150, I'd learned enough and I said, hey, I want to try to do like a podcast series about what you're telling me about Canada, about this history of Canada. That podcast never really got finished for personal reasons, but I was really happy to hear that somehow the conversations that we had and the few interviews that we did do back in the day around the one episode that I did get off the ground kind of laid the foundation for and gave Dr. Shipley the idea to put this book together, made him and I both realize that this information isn't all in one place and it's not written excessively, and we're missing a huge opportunity to teach people about the true nature of this country. But another reason that the podcast never got finished is because, as Tyler mentioned, the more you look into Canada's settler imperialist history, the more you realize you don't know, and the more it starts to kind of unravel. And what started off as like a little, 5 or 10 things that I would run through turned into like just hundreds of horrible atrocities that I think at the time, when you first learn them, you don't want to believe that about Canada. And that's what Dr. Shipley talks about, Canada the Good. This idea that everyone in Canada is just taught to presuppose that we're the good guys. And even if you hear about what we've done in Afghanistan or Papua New Guinea or Honduras, or going back South Africa, El Salvador, nobody internalizes it because they get to us first with this narrative about us being the good guy. The conversations I had with Dr. Shipley were really the first time I got straight answers on this country's propaganda, on that little feeling that I think every communist has, where you see something on TV, you see Peter Mansbridge or whoever talking, and you're like, no, that's not right. But everywhere you look, there's no language or fact to back you up. It's just a feeling until you come across this information that's so rare. The history in this book is new to a lot of people, but it's common knowledge for Indigenous peoples on Turtle Island. It's common knowledge for the people of Afghanistan who have opposed our occupation there for 20 years now. The fact that this book is such a bombshell is really just a testament to how strong the propaganda is in the settler imperialist ideology of Canada, and how low the bar has been set really by the so-called left in this country. The NDP, the Greens, you know, any beloved character that we have, our Ron MacLean, Gord Downey, Tommy Douglas, they're all still settler imperialists, and there's no option, there's no mainstream option for people who want to go further than that and really see this country for what it is. And I think that's the most important thing about Tyler's book and about his teaching style and the way that he talked to me during those interviews, is that he establishes a thread and a pattern, which is, I think, a testament to the value of the historical materialist worldview, that helps the audience see that Canada developed imperialism, developed capitalism through colonialism. And once you're able to educate people on that, I think it makes a lot more sense. So I am running out of time really quickly, but honestly, I just wanted to say, like, anybody watching this, it is your responsibility now to read this book, or read what you can, whatever excerpts, listen to Dr. Shipley, and then take this information and ruin every liberal progressive's day with it. Ruin parties, ruin family relationships, ruin your work, everything. It is your duty at this point, now that you know this. You can't go back from this. We're up against a far right that is winning because they see this country for what it is. They don't pretend to claim this land through anything but force. They don't pretend that they care about Indigenous people or colonized people. And they're gonna win if we don't drop the act and make this entire country confront the truth about what we are and the bullshit that we've learned. And if my little rinky-dink podcast that never even got off the ground accidentally came around to this book being written, then, like, you have no excuse not to tweet that or write that or make that video or that TikTok or that conversation with a friend, anything. It's all important, and I think it's at this point a responsibility. So I went a little bit over my time, but thank you so much for having me. I hope that was valuable.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Cass. That was very valuable. Over to Sara now. Welcome, Sara.
So thank you, Tyler, for having us be part of this. Like Cassandra, I also shared the surprise and the feeling of, like, feeling good at being asked to participate in this. And I had a conversation with Tyler first at length because a couple of years ago, when we were introduced to Cassandra, and I was assigned to write an article about what was going down in BC between the Wet'suwet'en Nation and the Canadian state and the RCMP and all of that at that time. Unfortunately, that article never came out. It is a point of self-criticism for some of us working in the media project at that time, of just being hung up on editorial perfection. And by the time, we wrote the story, the news had moved on and the story had kind of outgrown itself and transformed. But that conversation that I had with you, Tyler, which you had shared with me, is around the time that you were gathering your ideas for this book. It was very, very important and a significant learning point for me. I learned more in that one conversation than I had in my entire political science degree at U of T about Canadian colonialism, imperialism, and genocide, and the ongoing nature of it, and the nitty-gritty of the history of it, available generally. In my experience, right, just having lived in Toronto for the past 10 years, it's not something I came across until that conversation in such depth. But what I want to say is, beyond just enhancing my own personal learning or understanding to develop kind of a historical, political knowledge base and arsenal with which to, attack my own or other people's misunderstandings, it also pushed me to understand what it means to get the history of class struggle right, and how rare it is to actually meet people who have devoted their lives to writing out that history from the perspective of, or in the interest of, working people, Indigenous people, proletarians, oppressed people, both here in Canada and around the world. And that's where Tyler's work in all of the international imperialist projects and adventures of Canada also becomes important and relevant and fresh and angering, looking at all of it all together. So at that time, and this continues to present, is the struggle that we, and by we I mean myself and fellow organizers, Cassandra included, others as well, we have in doing mass mobilization and mass building work in the city and in the GTA, especially when it comes to more recent immigrants and people like myself from different parts of the third world who haven't grown up here, maybe whose kids are now growing up here and facing sort of a whitewashed Canadian history, but who have to find ourselves, locate our place in class struggle in the city and country, and also contend with the fact that there are peoples here who belong to this land, and we share a common struggle and common experience, even if the capitalist class doesn't want us to see it, even if different politicians and political parties obscure that relationship and that commonality we have. And I think even in some ways, even more importantly than the specifics of the history that I learned from Tyler and that we spoke about, was like learning strategies of how Tyler engages with his students, and I very much intend to plagiarize those tactics and strategies in doing mass work with youth and students and younger people and older people as well, from different parts of the city. I remember we spoke about or what I was bringing to that conversation with Tyler is like, okay, so here I am talking to Pakistani aunties who I'm very familiar with before, on being on an intellectual level, just on an intuitive level, that they have this specific experience migrating to Canada and finding themselves in the GTA. They may have been lower middle class or comfortably middle class back home, but once they've come here and settled in, these families have found themselves on a downward class trajectory. How in that person's experience, who might have actually been an employer of domestic servants back home, which are like basically modern day slaves, somebody who had that experience now coming here, how are we going to make more explicit their relationship to this land and why it didn't work out back home, and why housing and education and different things are a huge struggle here right now, and the Canadian promise of upward mobility is not actually materializing, and how do we work through racism amongst and between different immigrant communities and ignorance of the Indigenous struggle, and kind of the relationship between colonialism in the third world with European colonizers, and here in the first world with European colonizing past and present. So all of that is very complicated and very dense. But I think what I appreciate is being able to take this concrete research and like having translated that over a series of conversations with Tyler into how to struggle with people and how you struggle with your students. One way in which I think in this book, but also in our informal conversations, we've described or we talked about reconciliation is like the Canadian state saying, yes, we're pro-reconciliation, but in practice, not really doing that. And I think Tyler shared with me that he would share with his students, like, okay, it's as if somebody is apologizing to you, but then they do it again, and they still keep saying sorry, but they hit you again, or they hurt you again and again repeatedly. In the same way, we were talking about leadership from different Indigenous communities who have been bought over by the Canadian state and are put in a position where they have to manipulate or sell out the interests of the masses of their own people. And I think, Tyler, you gave the example of student unions, and like the university administration is fine if you want a bigger canteen or better snacks in the canteen, but the moment it comes to people actually asking for debt cancellation or free tuition, it's like, no, no, no. And in the same, so these are sorts of examples of how we can explain through popular education what the relationship is here in this land, and also make links, like I remember we were talking about railways and this misconception of railways being something that European colonizers have gifted to either Indigenous people here or to the third world, like in the Indian subcontinent, but it's not a no strings attached kind of thing. It's like a bloody colonizing project cloaked as modernization. And yeah, and I remember we were having this is in the East End in one of the tutoring after school program that some of me and my fellow comrades and organizers had helped set up. Is there was a session on Canadian colonialism for kids, and we were talking about land theft and colonization, and these are kids again from different parts of Asia and Africa who were like, oh, if that happened to me, yeah, I would be mad too. And we just had candid conversations about that. And so I felt, you know, at that point, and what I feel is instilling kind of that recognition leads to you recognizing, no matter whether you're Indigenous or not, what kind of self-determination you really have and what you want to fight for. And I think amongst immigrant communities, the best way to make us as immigrant communities and organizers realize our shared struggles with Indigenous communities is to keep doing this work through education and through demystifying what the Indigenous experience is, which happened for me very late in my experience in Canada, and also to just continue making work like this extremely accessible, and not just for the purpose of being we're all in one common shared struggle, let's hug each other and stuff. No, it's like we're trying to build fighting organizations and a class consciousness and class struggle in common with each other. So that's a large, long-term life goal, and I think I'm very grateful for Tyler's work in helping us all collectively advance that work. So yeah, that's everything I think I want to say right now. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much, Sara. Really, really thoughtful and informative. Great to have you here tonight. Last but not least, we have Veldon Coburn, who's an assistant professor in the Institute of Indigenous Research and Studies at the University of Ottawa, who's going to provide some final comments before we move on to the question and answer period. Welcome, Veldon.
Yeah, thank you for having me, and congratulations, Tyler, once again. Let me say, I'll just preface this by saying that Fernwood had come to me earlier in the spring about reviewing the book. And I was really busy. I've been swamped all year, and I thought it would land in my inbox as something like maybe 150 to 200 pages. But then I find this 500 plus page tome, and I thought, I wonder when I'm going to get the time for this. I really can't do this now. But I was familiar with Tyler's work before, and Tyler's also contributing to a book that I'm co-authoring, co-editing with Dave Thomas that's at political science and international relations at Mount Allison. So I had known of Tyler's work before on dispossession and Canadian state-backed capital expansion in South America, as well Central America, Honduras. So I had agreed to this, and then I see this massive PDF land into my inbox, and I thought, I'm never going to get this done. But it turns out the book is actually so well, and you might hear it and it might sound like cliche, but it is actually so very well written that for myself, I'd said, well, yeah, it's every now and then I come across a book that I wish I had written myself, because the writing is so well, but also so rigorous in its research that it makes me blush. It makes me I wish I was a better writer in my own work, and actually a researcher, and have, I guess, the gall and the nerve to go and write. And I guess as he had opened up with, the manuscript was almost 1,000 pages, and I don't doubt that at all. But I'll give some of the credit to the good editors at Fernwood, since we're on contract as well with Fernwood. So a little bit in the same family, but to get through this, it didn't really take that much effort, because, and I hope you all actually buy it, because it is such an easy read that you don't feel like you're walking through some sort of stilted history text. You get the politics and the political economy analysis throughout it, weaved through it just so masterfully that, again, it's something that I wish I had that kind of gift, except, my writing itself and research seems a little bit mechanical in the way that, I would never have the same storytelling gifts that Tyler does, with, again, the analysis and the research rigor to go through this and be able to present something that walked me through 500 pages as though I had read something that was 100 pages. And I could, before I go to bed at night, I thought I might read a chapter or two, and I was intent on reading almost everything that I reviewed from page to page, like every single word. And this one I did. And it was probably the best book I've read in a long time. There's a few others that I have, and there's another book that's kind of come out recently that I did have the chance to sort of review earlier. I see him on here, and I haven't seen him for a while. Hi, Devon Shaw. Devon Shaw, who's a prof out in British Columbia. His book came out recently. I've been delighted to, so I got a text. If you hear that ding, that's from Devon. Hey man, good to see you at Tyler's launch. Yes, it's good to see you too. I have to catch up sometime. Again, just incredibly swamped with work, but it was this makes it kind of pleasurable for you to read. And I was also sort of pleasantly surprised to see something that was so comprehensive, because it sort of rivals the large tomes that we get from blowhards that want to compact everything into its sort of a Conrad Black-esque sort of vanity project of, I need a pedestal to display my intellectual prowess on, is that, nothing short of encyclopedic sort of recitation of history will do for me, because I want the world to know how great and smart I am. Tyler actually pulls this off himself with this. And it was something that, if there were something, an alternative of that sort of ilk, which we're, inundated with, but not quite with the rigor that Tyler has, but so well written that you'll sail through it quite easily, because I could devour that book in a matter of days. And I did. It was nice nighttime reading, in the sense that I actually didn't want to stop reading and go to sleep, but I would. For me now, it is a book that is going to be a staple probably for, I could probably even foresee no competitive book like this for the next 10 or 15 years or so. And this will round out to, I guess, the other high praise that I have for Tyler's book is that at first when I heard he's writing Canada and the world, this particular approach, I thought, I hope when settler scholars, and I know his pointed analysis and critique of Canadian political economy and then Canadian imperialist and capitalist expansion across the globe as part of the colonial project. It should come from settler scholars to reveal the warts and put a few bruises on the body of a very angelic nation mythology that is spread around the world as the peacekeeping good guy of the world, when it has some pretty dark secrets that have been hidden, some skeletons in the closet, quite a few of them that contributed to its own economic aspirations as well as the nation building project that it's made for itself, that this book could actually displace and really ought to displace some of the more seminal works that in my own political science background, and I guess it's being a lot of the other social sciences and humanities disciplines would be familiar with. And still, I guess it runs and courses through the veins of Canadian storytelling and mythology is the works of, say, Harold Innis. So for a long time, just having gone through all the Canadian politics for years upon years and having to be spoon-fed, and it's still actually its own staple within the discipline itself, because it's still not read as sort of a piece of its own historical values that, well, this is what Canadians thought of themselves back in 1930s and, pre-Second World War. And this was this intellectual light bulb that went off that created this new school. But it's actually taught as contemporaneous kind of Canadian politics, is that this still informs and underwrites our understanding of Canada. And we're still reading Howard Innis as though it is that seminal work that, we just can't quite shake off. And so when I read this, I couldn't believe that, like, Tyler's actually pulling this off. He's writing something that we should never read. We should never read Harold Innis ever again, and we should only read Tyler Shipley. And this gets me to probably the largest praise that I can give to the book, is that at this point, and this was sort of like always sort of percolating in the back of my head, and I never had the wherewithal to do it myself, and I don't have the ambition to write something that's about 500 pages. I'd like to get succinct and quick pieces out there. Just being Indigenous and having the urgency to get think pieces and shape some current policy is, it's a slow moving machine. But for this, I always kind of had the fantasy that perhaps one day, and it was something that was better left to someone much better than myself, was somebody should write the equivalent of Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States. And I think Tyler did it. So when you're reading the first couple of chapters through it, you're like, this is actually, he's going back before in the way that Zinn did, and telling the story from this particular perspective and revealing all the warts and saying, yeah, this isn't a very pretty picture. This is actually quite an ugly body, and it's a monster that we're revealing here. Sorry, saw that I was muted. I'm unmuted again. You broke up the train of thought, Tanner. So that's the best I could probably say about this. But again, it's actually going to be, and I teach several courses on colonialism, but I also teach some classes on like grad level methods. But this is actually now a book that will be in each of my classes that I teach on colonialism. Even it will be assigned in introductory classes. I'm not teaching any introductory classes at the moment, but for Indigenous peoples and colonialism, I teach a second year class on colonialism, third year on colonialism, territory, and treaties. And these will, the first few chapters on Indigenous peoples, but also the rest that will inform, this is colonialism and how Canada participates in a particularly Western economic imperialist project. And it's deeply implicated in this, because I don't necessarily relegate or narrow my focus to colonialism, just say, well, in Canada or in one particular place, because this is a project where it's nation to nation. And there was a few things that Tyler says in the book that enlighten my thinking on this. And I do take the international perspective of two nations saying, well, we're in relations with one another, is that the line that perhaps no more significant piece of foreign policy that Canada has developed has been the Indian Act, of dominating other nations. And it is also the perspective that he brings as well, is that, you know, we can kind of hide behind this velvet curtain under the auspices, or that this is a domestic affair, but at the heart, it's actually really colonialism on an international level, and that this is a foreign nation imposing itself upon others. And you know, to that end, I guess I might say there's a great deal of legal and policy implications in terms of international law, which come into sharp relief when you start reading the book from that perspective, because it kind of comes out maybe in the first or second chapter when he begins discuss that after talking about some of the explorers coming over here. Sort of, I don't know if it was conscious or not, but if you read Howard Zinn's A People's History, he opens up talking about Columbus and the genocides that ensued, and sort of the European thematic tropes that begin to underwrite laws and the policy towards Indigenous peoples. But where Tyler does it himself, looking at you know, Cartier and others too, is I think he did it. I think he wrote the Canadian version of A People's History. And if you're not familiar with Howard Zinn's work, you must be. Most people here must be, because it sold millions of copies and it's so influential, and that I hope that this will resonate with everyone as well. So, and especially for an Indigenous person like myself, and for those that are interested in challenging the tight ties between corporate capital and the Canadian state, and its unabated desire to devour foreign nations, especially those within the borders of what it calls Canada, that this is an absolute must. And again, as Cassandra mentioned earlier, this is such accessible reading that you yourself will devour it as quickly as I did. So again, thank you, Tyler. This is actually a really great book. It's it is that good. So congratulations on this release, and thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, Velden. There's like so many quotables there, and I'm so happy that we have a video, because even just no more reading Innes, read Tyler Shipley. That should go on the back.
Yeah, I mean, it's 100 years later that Harold Innes's work is still being taught, and it's time to bury that. And I think that, you know, I think Shipley's work has done it.
That's wonderful. And again, Velden, apologies. I think I slightly cut you out for 15 seconds as I was admitting a few new people, and I accidentally hit the mute, but I think everyone heard you. So sorry about that.
That's okay.
Okay. But we have about 9 or 10 really great questions that I've bundled together from about 23 questions that have been submitted. And so I've tried to thematize them and synthesize as best I can. So I think we'll probably go just one by one, Tyler. And I'll ask the question, and then you could answer. And okay, so Tyler, the first question is, how does the military-industrial complex in Canada link with Canada's role in the world, and also tie in with the colonial ideology of white supremacy, old and new?
So, you know, when we think about the military-industrial complex in Canada, I suspect that many of us would immediately think of the Harper-Trudeau weapons deal with Saudi Arabia recently, which is the largest in Canadian history, that is supporting, you know, one of the most right-wing governments in the world in carrying out a horrific and arguably genocidal war in Yemen, as well as, you know, repressing critical movements within Saudi Arabia. We would think of that, and we're right to do so. But I think, you know, one thing that even surprised me to a certain extent in doing this research was how far back this stretches, and how consistent it's been that Canada has supported you know, right-wing governments around the world with weapons. You know, the example that jumps out to me is fascist Japan in the 1930s. You know, often overlooked, I think, in the West is the sort of the horrifying extent of Japanese atrocities during the fascist era. committed in Korea, in China, in other parts of East Asia. And throughout the period in which, or at least up until the point that Canada enters the war, Canada is supplying weapons to the Japanese fascist military. This includes in 1937, the assault on the city of Nanjing, which is still considered, one of the most horrific single events in the Pacific theater of the war. Not only is Canada providing the weapons for it, Canada is running diplomatic interference on behalf of fascist Japan. When Japan occupies parts of mainland China in 1935-36, the Canadian envoy to Japan says, "Hey, look, Japan is just doing what it did in Manchuria, which is to put its neighbor on a better path." This is how a Canadian diplomat is justifying Japanese fascist occupation of these places, and they're using Canadian weapons. It must have been really awkward, when Canadian soldiers arrive in the Pacific theater when that war begins, and they're fighting against an army that's been partly equipped by Canada. So there is a long sort of continuity there, and there's other cases sort of along the way. I mean, I mentioned El Salvador. Certainly, Canada supported the Salvadoran dictatorship with weapons. Canada helped the Somoza family in Nicaragua to maintain its position in the 1940s. Somoza, the dictator there, was a huge supporter of the Nazis, as well as a dictator in Nicaragua. And even the Americans, even the United States, was finding it awkward to have this relationship with Somoza, but it was Canadian companies and Canadian weapons that helped Somoza to stay in power in that moment. So yeah, there's continuities there.
It definitely. Thanks, Tyler. So we'll move on to the second question, which is, could you speak more to the role of extractivism in Canadian foreign policy? How does extractivism shape foreign policy, and relatedly, Canada's environmental policy here? What role do Canadian mining companies play?
Yeah, I mean, of course, this is a big one, right? And I think it's possible that some people will think that I maybe I gave less attention to this than I should have in the book, in part because I know that this is at least one area that does get some attention, some critical attention in Canada. There are some very good books already out on the extractive industry, and certainly Todd Gordon and Jeff Weber's book, Blood of Extraction, which is quite specific to that industry, and does a lot of the same things and is engaged in the same project that my book is engaged with, but with a much more specific focus on extractive industries. But another thing that I guess I would add, and I know I keep doing this, but my book is really about the continuities, the long sort of history of all of these things. So, to me, it's really important to connect, that colonialism in its first instance is about land. It's about getting land. It's about getting resources. It's about taking that land from Indigenous people by whatever means. And that is precisely what Canada continues and proceeds to do around the world with respect to Indigenous people's land. And people's land elsewhere. So whether it's, Mayan land in Guatemala that is seized by Canadian mining companies in the 1950s, whether we're talking about lands in Brazil seized by Canadian companies, or land in Burkina Faso. Consistently, Canada is out there trying to gain access to Indigenous land in order to extract oil, gas, metals, whatever it may be. As a matter of fact, this book, Cass and Sara both sort of talked about some of the genesis of this book. And, one of the first times I thought about doing this book was after a panel with my friend, colleague, Warren Bernauer and Karen Weisbart. We did a panel about the connection between contemporary Canadian policy towards Inuit land in what Canada calls its north, and connecting that to the way that Canadian companies behave in Honduras today. And what we found on the panel was that the strategies Canadian companies and the Canadian state uses to get land away from Honduran peasants, Honduran Indigenous people today in the 2010s, are very similar strategies to the ones that Canada and Canadian companies use to get land from Inuit in the north. So I do think that it's really important, and I do think this is a space in which you can really see those continuities, both in time and space.
Thank you, Tyler. The third question pertains to the role of the news media in maintaining the myth of Canada, the good in the world. So could you talk about how the media sort of sustains this myth of Canada, why it does this, how it does this, and what are your thoughts on what we can do to challenge and change that national mythology by changing the media and perhaps also changing the big rituals and celebrations like Canada Day? So there's a few parts to that question.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I definitely, one of the things I tried very consciously to do in the book is to draw quotes from the Canadian media across these different time periods. So, you know, you're not always hearing just from, you know, prime ministers and so on, but you're also hearing from the media that's doing such an important ideological piece on behalf of the Canadian ruling class. So, you know, it's often the media that sort of argues against, say, the decolonization of Africa in the 1960s. I mean, if there was any one piece in my research that surprised me, it was the extent to which the Canadian state and the Canadian media and Canadians in general were opposed to decolonization. And I say to my students, you know, my classes are you know, very diverse. So, you know, my students come from the sort of multiracial Canadian working classes. And I say to my students that if they or their parents or grandparents were born somewhere else in the world, there is a very good chance that the Canadian government and Canadians didn't want them to have their own state, because across the board, you know, in South Asia, in East Asia, in Africa, Canada was consistently opposed to the self-determination of the peoples of the global South. You know, it's the Canadian media that says that Congolese people are not ready to have their own state. They are not intelligent enough. They don't have the political maturity. They can't be trusted to run their own state. That's the Canadian media that says that. And this is consistent. And this is consistent right up to the present. I mean, what did the Canadian media say about Afghanistan? You know, for 15 years, the Canadian media repeated the claim that Afghans couldn't run their own country, that it was a failed state, you know, that it was backwards, that it was behind, that it required Canadian support in order to become a modern nation. Now, how many times were we told that the Canadian military was in Afghanistan to save women, to liberate women from the backwardness of Afghan culture? And by the way, in my chapter that deals with the war in Afghanistan, I talk about the fact that Canada was partly responsible for destroying those progressive movements within Afghanistan that were fighting for gender equality, that were fighting for tribal equality, for various forms of secularism. You know, I mean, there were left movements in Afghanistan that were destroyed by the United States and Canada, you know, and their allies. You know, and then of course Canada comes around and says, well, why can't you people get it together? You know, why don't you have any progressive movements? You know, why do you treat women this way? You know, so, you know, one of the things that I do in the book is I try to actually contextualize how it is that Canada finds itself in Afghanistan, you know, saying that, oh, there's no equality here. We're just trying to help them have equality. And it's in part because Canada created those conditions. And so, yes, the media, you know, plays a huge role in all of this. I know I haven't really addressed the second part of the question, which is about that mythology of the good Canada, which I guess, you know, I would just say it's obviously nonsense. It's obviously garbage, but it's very powerful in Canada. And I think that has a lot to do with the Canadian relationship to the United States. The fact that, you know, the empire is big and bullying and overt in the US. And so it's easy to slip into the shadows and imagine that Canada is somehow better. You know, that we say things a bit nicer and we do things a bit softer, and that could somehow mean that internationally and you know, that we're not as bad. And that mythology is really dangerous, I think. That mythology of Canadian innocence is why it has taken 150 years for Canadians to even begin to acknowledge that Canada is founded on genocide, which it obviously is. how anyone could look at any little piece of the history of Canada's relations with Indigenous nations and not see genocide is beyond me. And yet it is only very recently that that's even allowed to be discussed publicly. And we all know there's still huge resistance to that. Look at the reaction when John A. Macdonald's statue was toppled a couple weeks ago. So yeah, I think that mythology of the innocent Canadian runs very, very deep. I draw a lot of my analysis there from Shireen H. Razek, who's written extremely good work on that, especially in the context of the Somalia affair. So yeah, very, very important question. I hope I've kind of answered it.
That's great. And Cassandra has a point to make about the media as well, given the experience in journalism school and assessment of the media. So please, Cass.
Yeah, so just really quick, when I was talking, I forgot to get into this part specifically when I mentioned the Canadian propaganda machine. Canada's media ownership, if you map it out, is egregious. And just the other day, the already extremely wealthy bourgeois Torstar Media was acquired by Nordstar Media, which is attached to the family that the brother of that company also started the Raptors and the ACC. And just having gone to journalism school, I can speak. I attended Ryerson Journalism. The class that we had about media ownership and literacy, the one class where they mentioned and acknowledged media ownership in this country, and the consolidation of capital around that took place in the Rogers Communications Center, which was built with money from the Rogers family and Rogers Communication, where everybody, half the people that I graduated with went on to work for subsidiaries, media subsidiaries of that company. There's no, journalism students don't have to take a single history or politics class or anything for electives to be smart to go cover Palestine 2 years after they're hired or they graduate and they get hired somewhere else, or to cover the evictions, mass evictions going on in Toronto right now. CP24 sends a literal cop, Steve Ryan, not a journalist. He was a former investigator who got hired on as a journalist somehow at CP24. So I can't necessarily offer a solution, but I just wanted to drive home that point that right now Canada's left is in dire need of people's media, of really propaganda, but of journalism driven by working class people, colonized peoples, Indigenous peoples. Right now we're isolated to like Spring Mag and Canadian Dimension and a few others. And whatever it is, we need to find a way to first off confront and be smart about the media that we're consuming, and then apply that lens to even to CBC or now the Star, which has a leftist reputation somehow that is owned by this Nordstar company with ties to the far right. It's, you know, this to understanding the relationship of our current media to the information that Tyler puts forward in his book is a key part to this struggle and overcoming it. And that's it. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Moving on to the next question, Tyler, focuses on the role of aid, foreign aid in Canada's role in the world. What are the politics of aid? Did CETA eliminate politically tied aid for a certain period of time? Was there any change, or is there continuity in the use of aid to pursue these particular political objectives? So what are your thoughts on the role of aid?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think this is a complicated piece for sure, because you know, there have been at times institutions in Canada that have tried to sort of push back within the state, institutions that have tried to push back against this kind of colonial imperialist project. And, you know, in the book, I really try to be fair to those groups. There are these moments where, you know, NGOs and aid organizations really do try, and in some cases make some gains at pushing the Canadian state to not be so ruthless. And I mean, that's the best I can give them, but I do give it as a sincere compliment. And so, yeah, there are moments where aid has been used to support things that are good. But having said that, for the most part, I think aid has been pretty consistently used for political ends. Yeah, I'll give you an example that is just the first one that came to me, but in Chile in the 1960s, there is massive opposition to the capitalist government, to the capitalist system. Of course, this is a moment of revolutionary upsurge in all of Latin America. And by the early 60s, there's a huge movement of Chileans who are interested in pursuing socialism, and they are interested in voting for the socialist candidate in the 1964 elections, Salvador Allende. Canada pours a huge amount of aid money into supporting the candidacy of the centrist candidate, Eduardo Frei. He wins, so Canada's happy. They shower him with more than $8 million in aid. But in 1970, Chileans vote for Allende. Allende, the socialist, wins the elections in 1970. Now, all of a sudden, all of that aid that Canada was giving, ostensibly, out of generosity, right, to support Chilean institutions, to, build in Chilean infrastructure and so on. As soon as Chileans vote for Salvador Allende, Canada cuts it all off, effective immediately. And that is the Canadian position until September 11th, 1973, when Salvador Allende is murdered, Augusto Pinochet takes over, and Chile enters a 17-year nightmare under a right-wing dictatorship. At which point Canada immediately opens aid back up and starts showering the Pinochet government with foreign aid. It's just one example, but I think it certainly is one that captures what I think is the trend in terms of Canada's use of aid. There are cases where, of course, it's more subtle, where the uses of aid are more subtle. Yeah, we'll give you this aid, but you have to spend it on a contract to this Canadian company. A lot of the aid that's been given to Afghanistan since the occupation has functioned in that way. Sure, we'll give you $1 million to build hospitals, but you have to let SNC-Lavalin do all of the work here. So yeah, I guess my only last thought on aid and sort of the NGO sector would be to plug Drew Ojije and Nick Barry-Shaw's book, Paved with Good Intentions, which I think might have been Fernwood as well, might have been Between the Lines, I don't remember, but another good critical left book about the NGO. Yes, that's giving me a thumbs up. Yeah, very good book on that sector that's worth a read.
Great, thanks, Tyler. Okay, I've got about 28 questions that I'm trying to synthesize thematically, so bear with me here. Let's see. Okay, kind of a state theory, state politics style question. Can you say more about the problem of the Canadian state politically, or just the state in general as related to emancipatory or liberatory struggles today? What are your thoughts on the question of the state in general? And relatedly, what role has sort of left nationalism played in either sort of, limiting or sort of like, enabling the kinds of struggles that we need today?
It's like a dissertation defense.
I know. I mean, I'm back with like Poulantzas Miliband. What do we do?
I mean, I guess, okay, here's how I'll approach this question. In a very oversimplistic way, in a way that doesn't, I'm not going to engage too deeply in Poulantzas and Miliband and so on, but what I will say is this. I understand in this book, I operate from the assumption that the state under capitalism is a reflection of the interests of the capitalist class. Now that happens in complicated ways. As I just mentioned, there's moments of pushback. There are different factions within the thing called the state. Sometimes the NDP get a few, relatively, progressive-minded people in there who shake things up a little bit. Sometimes there's an NGO that really pushes in a particular direction. Often activist networks will have an influence on the Canadian state. Canada accepts refugees from Chile, actually. The case I was just talking about. Canada accepted thousands of refugees from Pinochet, from Chile, which doesn't make sense given its earlier position. That happened because of on-the-ground activist work within Canada pressuring the Canadian state to do that. So the state is subject to all kinds of these forces, popular forces, and it does bend with those things. But fundamentally, the Canadian state represents and reflects the interests of the Canadian ruling class, as it always has, as it did when John A. Macdonald, brought the other confederators together and said, what we really need to do is conquer the West. You know, what we really need to do is clear the indigenous people off the plains and claim that land so that we can build this intercontinental, you know, state in opposition to the United States and make this a viable national project. So I understand the state to be reflective of those interests. And when I talk about Canada and the thing called Canada and Canada acting in the world, it is a reflection of what the Canadian capitalist class wants to do. So that is how I sort of understand it. To the second part of the question about left nationalism, for those that don't know the term or don't know what it means, I mean, it can mean a lot of different things, but I usually think of it as a kind of it's a section within the Canadian left that dates back to the 50s and 60s at least, that argues that the problem in Canada is that the United States bullies us. The Canadian state is filled with decent people, you know, some more than others, but people who could be pulled and would naturally be inclined to a much more progressive kind of politics. But the problem is we are beholden to US power. There is no way we can say no to what Uncle Sam wants. And therefore, the project should be a kind of Canadian nationalism that asserts Canadian independence from the United States so that Canada can do the good in the world that we know we would be doing if we could. And you can see the sarcasm slip in there at the end. I try not to, but it did. I don't like this thesis at all. I don't accept it at all. And I think a big part of this project, you know, deep in my subconscious, you know, was kind of anger at that section. And a lot of people who I like, people who I respect, who do sort of fall into a version of that. So I don't want to be too dismissive. But I think it's just too tempting. You know, it's this tempting way in which we can imagine that, no, Canadians are good. We mean well. I'm a good person. I don't want to colonize or conquer. But I just have no choice. We've just been sucked into this. And if we could just, you know, if we could just get ourselves out of Uncle Sam's grip, we could do all the good things we want to do. And I don't buy it. And I make the argument, it's sustained in the book, that Canada is acting on its own interest. Yes, in concert with first the British Empire and then the American Empire, but that the Canadian ruling class is working within those structures for its own advantage. And in some cases, pushing the frontiers of those sort of imperialist projects. So I don't believe in left nationalism. I don't believe in any kind of Canadian nationalism at all. And I think it's a real impediment to doing the work we need to do to dismantle some of these very oppressive structures and replace them with something much better.
Thanks, Tyler. Shifting over to a question just about public reception to the work. I mean, you've written about these topics for many years and you've published other books on the topic. You know, Canadians en masse pride themselves as being non-imperialist peacekeepers and so on. Have you experienced any blowback or pushback for exposing the hard truths of Canadian foreign policy? Or
yeah, I mean, it hasn't, you know, it hasn't quite got that reach yet. So, you know, I'm still waiting for that, but I do expect it. And I certainly get it all the time in the work that I do. And it makes sense. It makes sense that, you know, people who are true believers in, you know, in the Canadian nationalist project would be offended by some jerk who comes around and says that Canada's doing a bunch of bad things. I'm not really inclined to get into sort of arguments with the far right. You know, I'm not going to debate Aaron O'Toole about these things because I think we have fundamentally different projects. We want different things. But I am obviously interested in engaging with people who come to a kind of Canadian nationalism, I guess more honestly, that's not quite the word I mean, but who wouldn't necessarily like the things that I describe in this book, who wouldn't support them. And yet have a hard time believing that Canada could actually do these things and behave these ways. And I do encounter that sort of thing all the time. I mean, I'm very active on Twitter, but mostly to talk about the Vancouver Canucks hockey team, which is a little embarrassing. So I have this massive sort of hockey Twitter following. Some people might even be here. And, you know, this is a real cross-section, I think, of Canadian society. It's not like a little lefty club. You know, you get everyone from Trump supporters to, you know, true blue, or I guess true red, liberal, Trudeau supporters, everything across the board, to, very well-intentioned NDP and left liberals, a real range. And I do think that part of the project here has to be about how do we speak with people who have spent their entire lives being told that Canada's good and Canada's trying to do good and wants to do good and so on. So I do think this book is written to kind of engage with that. And, I really rely on letting Canadians speak for themselves. You don't have to read the book and you're not getting lectured by me when you read the book, which is how I approach my teaching as well, and actually I see at least one person here who was in a class with me. My teaching is not about, going in there and necessarily insisting that I know how it is. I let Canadians speak for themselves. I let John A. Macdonald say his piece, and then you can assess. I let A.B. Brody speak about the Congolese education system when he claims that Congolese people should not learn Congolese history because there are more important and valuable things for them to learn. This is a Canadian official speaking about the Congolese education system. I let him do the speaking. So in that sense, I hope that the idea is that you don't have to believe me. Believe them, believe the Canadians that bragged an hour after the detonation of the atomic bomb. The Canadians who bragged about Canada's integral role in that process, in developing the bomb and deciding to drop it. I mean, they're the ones who bragged about it, not me. So in that sense, yeah, when that sort of pushback comes, I like to just sort of let the material and let the people in this story do the talking.
Great. Thanks, Tyler. So I've got about two more sort of clusters of questions that I think I'll pose simultaneously for you, and then you can address them as you like. The first relates to some of the thoughtful remarks you just made about teaching and decolonizing the classroom and pedagogical strategies for sort of engaging and educating students to perhaps learn about these histories and change the way they think about Canada and the world. So have you sort of found any useful strategies for decolonizing the classroom and even at the sort of elementary level, the high school level, so many new Canadians, young Canadians singing the national anthem, part of an indoctrination process that allied sort of the history of genocide and the ongoing settler colonial mentality or renders it invisible. Like what can we do as educators, inside and outside of the classroom to decolonize the classroom and everything beyond? So it's sort of the first educational question. And then I think the final question relates more to struggle and resistance, what's to be done. So does your approach to studying history favor a particular approach to the struggle against settler and racial capitalism? I mean, what should we be sort of fighting for, calling for, demanding? Reconciliation, restitution, restoration, reparations? What should be done? And I'd also like to invite Velden to share some thoughts as well to that final question. And one of the actually questions sort of asked Velden, was there anything you would add to Tyler's book that Tyler might have missed? And so the first cluster of questions in summing up was about education and decolonizing the classroom. And the second one was about sort of real strategy and tactics today for resisting a settler and racial capitalism in Canada and beyond.
Why don't we go to Velden first? Because I've been going, so yeah, you take a turn.
Oh, geez, I could be here all night too when we talk about decolonizing the classroom, and that's a big issue too because, well, the workload often gets thrown onto tokens like myself in these institutions at the universities that pretty soon there's going to be a revolt amongst Indigenous faculty. I know part of my value here is being one of the only Algonquin scholars on our territory at one of the institutions here at either Carleton or Ottawa. Well, there's other ones like St. Paul and the University of Outaouais of the University of Quebec system. And is that you're always called upon to answer these questions. So that's a long-winded kind of response to saying, well, thanks, Tanner, and thanks, Tyler. I think there's a lot of resources out there, but maybe I'll address the other part of the question too, is about race and resistance. Uh, one of the things that are in the news today right here on Algonquin territory is up in Barrier Lake is that the Algonquins are sort of, well, they have a barricade on highways to limit hunters in because I guess, they're the overhunting moose on our territory. And it's, a lot of it's sort of sport hunting. They throw a lot of it away. Is that we're still, in terms of foreign policy, is that we actually don't have a treaty that kind of binds us in international relations, I guess, well, in the contemporary or modern period itself. And that, there's past historic treaties that we still have that are just ignored. And they're still sort of really glossed over as part of whenever Canada does acknowledge some of its history of the Indigenous foundations here, is that, well, there was these nice little agreements that we had, and we got together and we had a few laughs, and we tried to be nice to them, and then we moved forward, and it's really, they're just artifacts of history, and they belong in a museum, and they don't actually belong within our laws themselves. I know somebody else who's on here is one of the other Algonquin scholars here, Dr. Lynn Gale. I see her here. She's actually probably one of Canada's best, I guess, scholars on the treaties, especially for Algonquin territory. So I hate to say that I can't really speak to a whole lot of it as much as she can, but she's from my home community and cousins and whatnot. So Pikwakanagan is where we're from, but what about race relations and decolonization here? We're at a cultural moment too where it's really heightened and amplified, and it's on the radar for everyone too. So I have a lot of thoughts about it too, because, well, there's also a lot of racial divisions, and I'm starting to become a little bit exhausted and exasperated by a lot of the work that hardens the divisions themselves, because Indigenous nations have been reduced to cultures and races, and that's what has been sort of the legalistic sort of rhetorical trick of saying, well, you're not nations of sovereigns, you're just a group of people that might have an ethnicity, that you might share sort of some cultural practices, and that's what only binds you as a social group, but not necessarily as those who can be self-governing or self-determining peoples. You're more like a loosely grouped association that likes to get together and eat certain sort of ethnic foods or what have you. And well, we'll treat you as a different race. We'll racialize you in our legislation and build that into the framework of us dominating and dispossessing you. So I have a hard time thinking about the directions where it's going these days, especially with the sharper divisions becoming between races and the sort of hostilities. I come from a multiracial family myself. Like, I have a Black daughter who's Black and Indigenous mix and what have you. So you see the Black Lives Matter, and I start to think that, well, you're also Algonquin, you're a member of the Algonquins of Pikwakanagan, and that's more of a political identity, that you're a member of a political community that is, I guess, formalized as citizenship and not just a racial group. And we're still fighting for that, because it's not just race that has a moral claim within our own theories of justice to territory and governing within that bounded territory. It's a peoplehood of a nation, and not just races, where eventually, if we are self-determining and do have the sort of political control, as it becomes a political communities, that it would be multiracial. But for the meantime, we do have to contend with the fact that we are racialized by somebody else, by foreign powers, and they treat us as such. So ignoring that is pretty much futile, because it's actually like enshrined within the Indian Act, and it does divide us. So, I mean, I don't know if you want another little guest speaker, if Lynn is still there, because Lynn actually went to the Supreme Court of Canada in one of the probably the 4 foundational decisions, because she challenged, and it took her 30 years. I don't know if Lynn wants to, Dr.
Please, welcome, Lynn.
Hi, Koi Koi, and thank you for that. I can understand, yes, I know a little bit about the treaty process here in Canada. I can't talk about it in an international sense, but today Canada continues to impose extinguishment and genocide on Indigenous nations. The Algonquins of Pikwakanagan are in a land claim process, and that land claim process will place us as a municipality, as a fourth level of government. And I can't even blame Pikwakanagan, even if I don't agree with it, and I do believe we are deserving of a treaty on a nation-to-nation basis. We have people in the community who need land and money now and resources now. And so what they've done is they put Pikwakanagan in a very tight situation. So a lot of people will criticize the non-status and the Algonquins for agreeing to a land claim process, but I don't think we should be criticizing the people. We should be criticizing the Canadian state. And Canada is continuing to commit genocide. It hasn't ended. You know, we have two commissions that have said so, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, as well as the MMIWG. They ended and concluded that it is genocide, that it continues today. I am living through genocide, and it's a very miserable way to live. And because people want me to be happy, right? Come on, then be happy. Well, no, I'm living genocide, and it's been very, very hard. And a lot of the new people that are coming to Canada and the settlers, they're gaining off of the genocide of Indigenous people, and they're not learning about our history. They're being brainwashed in Canada's education system. And the beginning of that brainwashing starts with singing "O Canada." Right? Hegemony of the runs much deeper in the heart than it does in the mind. And once you convince people they're Canadians, they won't even understand the genocide.
Yeah, I think like I can echo a little bit of those because Lynn and I actually were having a quick exchange earlier this morning, just through text and messages and about that. But we also, just because Dr. Gale herself is chosen not to be within academia, when we talk about decolonization in education, is that I often struggle with the fact too, like I toss up the idea, why am I still in academia? And I've only been in a few years post, after my PhD, and I just become frustrated with the institution itself, because it's also kind of in service of the capitalist ruling class as well. I can say it about the University of Ottawa, is that like the tight links with organized capital are quite pronounced. There's a lot that I could talk at length, and it usually will come up at any time, and somebody will always kind of ask me to, come and speak, give a guest speak on this, and that it's a really wrought and unwieldy subject. That's complicated too by a lot of the class divisions that I guess most of my work these days, because I've kind of turned away from my own work in identity and race because of the personal politics that come after me, and as somebody that might publish something on it, is that there will be attacks against me. Somebody will be unhappy about it. And it's not just like, somebody on Twitter, is there will be complaints to the university or whatnot. So I've leaned more towards the work that is aligned with what Tyler's doing, what he's contributing on material dispossession, especially these more kind of more posts, neo-Marxian kind of modes of dispossession as well. So looking at that and to see the economic sort of materialism in our lives as Indigenous peoples, rather than, and this is also kind of in respect to Black lives as well, is to let them center themselves in current racial discussions right now, is that they may not have, this moment could be washed over again, depending on how the political tides turn in who becomes dominant. Because you see little hints of it here and there, is that the likes of, say, Aaron O'Toole and their ilk that are striving to become again in the seat of power, is that they get deeply upset whenever the head comes off or the statue tips over of Sir John A. Macdonald, and I'll laugh at that, but I remember saying to my partner that the very next day I said, you know what, was that just a lot of bored suburban kids? And it really resonated with me just the other day, or even maybe this morning when I was listening to CBC before lunch when they were playing the podcast about the October crisis, is that, French Quebecois liberationists, they wanted to, take down statues as well. And now they're doing it in the name of Indigenous liberation, but they're not really over in Quebec. But, I just thought, the symbolic gestures towards sort of racial liberation, it didn't change my life. And here on Algonquin territory, we still can't drink the water, in Kittigan-Zibi, which is just north of where I am right now, an hour and a half north of the capital. And so, while yes, I do giggle at seeing the statue tip over and the head come off, it didn't change my life. It didn't make me any better off. And it's certainly for Dr. Gale as well as 30 years to the Supreme Court, I guess. Yeah, through
a Court of Appeal. The Court of Appeal.
Oh yeah, because the federal government chose not to go to the Supreme Court.
Oh, well, that's a long story. But yeah, I went to the Court of Appeal. I mean, a big part of it had to do with I had no money to navigate the whole legal system. Yeah,
but for that, I mean, amongst the four big cases, Lovelace, Bedard, MacIver, yeah. So probably about the four big ones on Indian Act identity right now. So we see that division, and when Tyler talks about it, it's deeply profound. And to see it happen to one of like my cousins, and probably the first PhD to come out of Pikwakanagan. I didn't know anyone before Lynn, you. It is a very serious lived reality, and the work that, say, Tyler does, it brings this into pretty sharp relief for the lived lives of our everyday lives of me and family members. So, yeah, that's a really roundabout and very convoluted way of trying to get to two answers. And
yeah, I just kind of wish that more Canadians understood who the Algonquins were, because Parliament Hill is on our land. Right? Mm-hmm. It's on Algonquin land, and nobody knows who the Algonquins are. As a matter of fact, I've had a hard time learning who the Algonquins are. I've been spending the last few weeks learning more about the Quebec Algonquins and the things that they're going through. Why is it that there's reserves in Quebec, but there's no treaties? How did that come about? And why was it that that province didn't have to engage in treaties with the Algonquins like they did in other provinces? And I think that's part of Canada's genocide, is this whole erasure of who the Algonquins are. And what's happening, because Ottawa is the capital city, we have all these Indigenous people coming into the capital, and everybody's focusing on the Nishka and the Wet'suwet'en and the Cree, and then the Algonquin knowledge gets lost in all this. But a fundamental principle of Indigenous knowledge is you focus on the local Indigenous people. So there should be really more space created for Algonquin knowledge, and it's not happening. And I think that serves Canada to do that, right?
Yeah, and that goes back to one of the earlier questions that Tyler got and answered about the media not being able to bring these things to light, is that there's also this deep erasure. So sort of like hidden in plain view of Indigenous peoples in the, sort of an awakening in this post-reconciliation era. Is that, well, on the 150th anniversary, I was there on the night, staring off, and Devon Shaw was there too. Devon came, he just flew into town, and I texted him, and he just landed at the airport and said he's coming down, and there's standoff with all the police forces, RCMP, Parliamentary Protective Services, Ottawa Police, and we erected the teepee that night at 3 o'clock in the morning after finally getting permission. I often tell my students that out of all of Canada, Algonquin territory is perhaps the most colonized, because just down the street, there's sovereign territory for all the consulates, embassies, and what have you. Almost every nation in the world has taken a chunk of Algonquin territory. So, you know, just down the road or like across the street almost from Ottawa U's campus on King Edward, there's Angola. Down the street is Russia. And I'm looking around that this was all given out to other foreign nations, and yet the intrusion within and an ongoing dispossession is still a very relevant issue today. And
yes, they're only offering us 1.3% of our territory, and it went up from 300 million to an $800 million buyout, a one-time buyout. So that's for a whole nation. That's what Canada is willing to give us, 1.3% of our territory, and that's only in Ontario because they did divide us. So yes, the genocide of the Algonquin people is Canada's biggest secret, and I'm convinced that's why I can't get a platform, or I can't get any space, because who wants to hear about the Algonquin genocide, right? Let's kill that.
I just quickly add to, so I always wonder when here being in Ottawa on Algonquin territory is that everyone comes from everywhere else for the national Indigenous organizations to INAC to plant their little place here, and never see or hear from anything from the Algonquin. And so the percentage being quite right is that for 36,000 square kilometers for the Ontario Algonquins of Ontario Modern Land Claim, which was started in 1983, the agreement in principle is for 476 square kilometers out of 36,000. That's what they'll leave us with. And the 300 million isn't actually like a per capita payout. It's an economic development. So nobody's going to get money. And
They increased it to 800 million, and I should say that the land base, the 1.3%, it's discontiguous. They won't let us be together.
Yeah.
Because we'd be too powerful together, right?
Yeah. So I mean, it's like 20 acres over here, and then it's 100 acres, 20 miles away. So, but anyway, sorry, I think we've colonized Tyler's
decolonized
book launch.
Decolonized, I would say.
Yeah, so there's your decolonization. Yeah. We're taking it back. That's our That's our resistance in education. Yeah.
Thank you, Tyler.
Yeah.
I mean, I would have just described, like, not only is that consistent with how colonization starts, right? It's, disconnecting nations, having people be physically separated, right, to stop resistance from happening or to undermine resistance. But then also so much of what you both were just talking about is also then reproduced in other parts of the world. So Honduras is the case that I know very well because I've spent a lot of time there and worked with the movement there. And when Canadian companies want to try to get Indigenous land for their projects, they use so many of these same strategies. Getting in, dividing communities, playing people against one another. Something you mentioned, Lynn, about not being able to really blame people when people are in very vulnerable circumstances. And the state offers them something. Of course, they take it. Even if that even if that includes consequences that they know are far-reaching and significant. Sometimes there's just, you have no choice. And that is a conscious strategy of the Canadian state. It has been for a very long time. It goes all the way back to the clearing of the plains and John A. Macdonald putting people into conditions of starvation and then ramping up those conditions so that he could sign treaties from a position of strength. So yeah, I mean, everything that you've been talking about, I think, I would just add that it is consistent, right? It's across the board. It happens both, within what Canada has claimed as its territory and outside of it. I guess just to come back to the other question, Tanner, that you had asked at the start about teaching in the academy and all of those things. I guess the one other thing I would add to all of this is that, I do think that, as a settler scholar myself, I really bear a certain responsibility to do this work and to sort of put myself, these are complicated things, maybe not to the front, but certainly to put myself out there to kind of to take the pushback. If there's anyone who is insulated in the institution, it's me, right? So I'm in a position where I can put this argument out, and I'm willing to take the heat that I do get, and will get, because I think it's, I have more room to do that. And so I do, and I have, and in the book, one thing that I debated this, but I did end up doing in the book is I actually situate myself at various points, just in small ways. But, you know, I talk about the fact that, you know, my family were settlers that took up land in Manitoba immediately after that land had been seized from the Cree. You know, within the space of, I mean, it's the 1870, immediately after the Red River Rebellion, and Canada explicitly, you know, takes that land and then sends settlers from Ontario. And, you know, ancestors of mine had settled in Ontario, working class people from England who had settled in Ontario, took up homesteads, and then went and took up that Indigenous land. And I try in the book to tease out the ways in which, you know, my great-grandparents, you know, at a certain level were fleeing industrial capitalism in England. I mean, they were fleeing poverty in England. What drew them to what became Canada was economic marginalization in England. But they then, as part of the settlement project, they become colonizers. Yeah. You know, they willingly take up the role of settlers and colonizers. They, you know, don't think twice about the fact that they're taking up stolen land. And I think this is something that, as a settler scholar, I certainly have to, you know, be honest about. I have to sort of own, you know, and that has to be part of the discussion. And I think that doing that is actually a useful teaching tool. I do it in my classes. I talk about my own family, my own position in all of this with my students. And I think that's valuable. I think it's valuable both so that they can see, you know, that this is the trajectory, that many people who are currently living in Canada are settlers and are descendant of settlers in one way or another. And also to model it, right? Because, and this comes back to something that Sara said right at the start, right? That most of us on this land are settlers of some form. And we have to own that if we're going to decolonize. If we're going to be part of decolonization, you know, the first step is the look in the mirror. The first step is to be honest about what our role is, what our position is on this land. So that is something that I bring into my teaching. And I try to do it. The last thing I'll add is that, you know, this sort of comes off of what Velden said about the Johnny MacDonald statue and the sort of performativity of some of that. I mean, there's a performativity to a lot of left activism today, especially when it's in the academy or connected to the academy. There's a lot of performativity around it. There's a lot of like, well, I'm going to center myself and my experience, and I'm going to put out my, you know, what is my privilege and all of this stuff. Some of that is very obviously good. Some of that's important, but I do think we need to sort of, we need to act. We need to sort of put our politics into practice. We need to do more. We need to be doing things that are real and immediate, and are making an immediate difference. So yeah, knock down a statue, that's cool. You know, but let's also organize and support blockades. You know, let's make sure that the next time there's an Indigenous blockade of a railroad, that we're going and that we're standing there, that we're doing these things. And to take it a step further, let's make sure that we're building something more. Let's be part of the project to build something more than a single blockade, but, you know, a full-fledged anti-colonial project, anti-capitalist project, you know, that takes leadership from Indigenous struggles, but which also brings in the multiracial working classes of, you know, what became Canada. You know, all of us from various different positions, located in different ways within that. So, you know, I hope that this book will go some way in helping to at least do some ideological work around that, you know, and I hope that in our teaching, you know, we can do some of that work as well. And, you know, most of all, I hope that we will find ways of building the movements that can actually take that on. I don't have the answer. I'm going to plead the fifth in terms of the various, you know, approaches to revolutionary strategy, at least, you know, in this Zoom call, but we do need to figure it out, right? So I hope we will get serious about doing that work.
All right. Well, I think that's a really, really wonderful way to conclude the night's event. So check out the Socialist Project for more lefty media. There's other great sites as well, the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute, and many other resources for the new and emerging 21st century left in Canada and elsewhere. I think that's all for tonight, and I'm actually feeling really happy because I'm seeing Tyler's cat now. So take a look at Tyler's screen if you haven't already. Tyler, who do we have there?
This is Benigni. He's my 13-year-old diabetic cat. And
oh, okay.
A bit of a telling me to shut up. He's trying to decolonize this session as well.
Scratching your beard. Okay, so again, congratulations, Tyler. Thanks to everyone for joining us tonight. We hope to see you again at some point. Keep up the fight, keep up the struggle. In Sol, the best to all. Good night.
Thanks, Tanner.